It is Sunday, January 2nd, and this is our Insider Access weekly outlook briefing. And I'm going to make a big portion of this available to the public. It's not something we do too frequently, but of course, I like to provide some information to retail. I know this is a really critical time where people can make a lot of mistakes and are looking for a little bit of insight in how they could trade, perhaps take advantage or what they should do regarding tariffs. I'm going to provide some of my ideas and insight on that. Importantly, though, I want to start here. We closed out last week. It was very positive. We were on a very positive trajectory, and a lot of people missed that. And that started with a dovish Fed. And something that I explained, I'm going to bring up a few charts here. So something I explained to insiders was that the reason markets were being priced lower is because there was actually a pricing in up to 28% likelihood was being priced into the markets based on Polymarket here, that there would be a hike for the Feds in 2025. And what I told insiders was that this is wrong. They're off. The markets are pricing this off. This is an opportunity for us to exploit, and that will start to come crashing down. It will culminate with the Fed, but of course we're going to have better CPI data, better PCE data, and then we will have a dovish pause. And I think that was something a lot of people weren't expecting, because you think dovish pause, they're pausing. That's the opposite of dovish, right? Or close to the opposite. That's neutral. That's nothing good. People don't like that. We were on a trajectory where the Feds were cutting, and now we've paused. That's the wrong direction. But it's a dovish pause because the Feds gave us a lot to work with. Powell dispelled any thoughts that the Feds were changing their direction or that they would potentially hike. And that's why we saw this number come crashing down from 28%. And this is just in January, in those few days. So as the probability decreases of a hike, the markets become more optimistic, right? And then, of course, what we got from that, we also had Powell saying, look, this was very dovish. Feds don't need to wait for 2% for inflation to cut rates, right? So he's being aggressive again and saying, look, we don't even need to wait till we get to 2%. We might cut sooner. So all these ideas that we are pivoting and becoming hawkish and becoming a little bit more skeptical about the economy, those are your words, not our words. Now, importantly, on Friday, we got more because we had a good CPI reading, but on Friday, and this is straight from Discord, I was projecting lower than 0.19%, so continued dropping of inflation. The markets had gotten into this phase where they're starting to think, and you're going to hear this from so many analysts who just, I don't know how they get their calculations, and I don't want to get into what some of the cohort does, and I'm talking about professionals and fund managers and people you see on MSNBC and CNN and CNBC and all the other networks. I'll put them aside. I don't think their work is very good. I don't know where they get their numbers from, but they're certainly far too hawkish all the time. And there's this inflation is sticky and inflation is resurging. In fact, what we not only saw a sub 0.19, 0.16 came in much lower than expected. And really, we see that we are coming much closer to the Fed's target. And if we annualized on a quarterly basis, right, in the last 3 months, 2.2%. Okay, so we know why the markets were running up. We know why there was a dip. I also want to kind of pull this up to demonstrate what we feel. So from a top-down view, my view is that we will have a bit of a rebound here. And here's what we saw. It's my friend Beaker, right? And Beaker he's a very panicked kind of guy. That's the best I could do for personality or humor. So what we saw with DeepSeek, we saw the DeepSeek panic. Markets absolutely fell off of a cliff because the concern was, okay, the AI run is over and NVIDIA won't be able to sell any more chips because you can get that sort of performance for $5 out of a vending machine and a processor in China. And of course, that's nonsense. They optimized on a model, but that doesn't mean they've taken steps forward, right? So you can see it's less compute power needed, so on and so forth. I won't rehash it. This was my explanation to insiders. I said it's a buy opportunity, right? This is panic. It's oversold. And what an opportunity that was. Here we are again. Trade war panic. This might take a little bit longer to flesh out, but there are some wrinkles here, and I'm going to give you the analysis. To those who are watching and they're just looking for sort of a summary idea, if you have the patience, buy your favorite names, buy their performing names. This is an opportunity. It is an opportunity. The downside, I think we're going to break trend. We're gapping down in the after hours. Somebody asked me a question about 3-4 o'clock. They said, do you think futures open positive? Do we bounce or is it going to be negative? I said there's more downside to go because there's still a little bit more fear and panic. And this was just swelling up into the after hours. And we've had more rhetoric over the weekend. Some silly talk from one of the candidates running potentially for the lead of the Liberal Party within Canada saying, well, we'll tariff 100% on everything. But this individual is about as inept as you get. Long story short, a lot of fear, a lot of panic. So here we are again. Panic creates opportunity. In fact, something I want to say is, you might look at it and say, well, where was this before? Is this hindsight? Even though I was accurate, of course, about DeepSeek. Well, in fact, I projected this coming into the year. If you watch my 2025 outlook, I didn't write this every year. I've had published my last few outlooks publicly. And to insiders and to everybody in public, I put this up on my X profile. I said 2025, and of course I have a photo of President Trump, and here's Chair Powell. 2025 is ripe with opportunity for trading due to high volatility requiring dynamic positioning and trading. Meaning, even if things are going your way, and I explain this to insiders all the time, you can have the best analysis, right? And everything could be going your way, and the markets could be running up, and there could be a war declared overnight, and the markets drop. Does that mean you're a horrible analyst? I thought you were the best. Yeah, well, I don't have the highest government clearance in the world, and nobody does. And when you hear the Furus saying things like, I knew there was going to be an attack on Israel on October 7th. No, you didn't. Stop it. Or I knew the Russia war was going to break out on this day with Ukraine. No, you just knock it off, right? People like that should not be taken seriously. And if you did, you're at the highest level of government and intel. I don't know what you're doing broadcasting your thoughts on X. Or anyone where else for that matter. So this was part of my 2025 outlook. I said, you have to be ready for dynamic positioning and trading, but that presents a lot of opportunity. And then of course, I reiterate that. So this is later. This wasn't part of the public presentation, but to insiders, one of our market themes. So we have themes about different sectors last year. A lot of it was AI, and we're looking at technology themes, so on and so forth for investing. And I said just a market theme, although this isn't a sector, and we did our sectors overweight, underweight, etc. I said, unlike previous years, this is a new administration. That signals change. Change equals volatility for the markets. Markets like to work with what they know. We expect volatility with peaks and valleys that create strong opportunity and require dynamic, timely adjustments, right? And so it doesn't mean you'll be ahead of the news cycle every single time. Like if it is something that is geopolitical, a war breaks out, you probably didn't know, and your friend in the basement or Furu Joe, who last week was at Starbucks, but now is telling you that he has the inside intel in behind NATO. It just, again, discard all of that. That's okay. You're not going to know everything, but it creates opportunity. As we said, if we look at what happened after DeepSeek, right? Big recovery on the market, panic. And now we have the trade war panic. So let me explain a little bit about this. First of all, I think most analysts are getting it wrong. Let's pull this up. The White House issued this, and it's a fact sheet. President Donald J. Trump imposed tariffs on imports from Canada, Mexico, and China. And I'm going to explain to you why this is an opportunity and some of the timelines here. So he says, until the crisis is alleviated, we're putting in 25% additional tariff on imports from Canada and Mexico. Energy resources only have a 10% tariff, right? Because he's trying to keep the economy strong, not have to worry about that. Now, the conversation is all about fentanyl and securing the border. So I think where analysts are getting this wrong is they're saying, don't worry, this isn't a trade war. This has nothing to do with trade, right? They're trying to calm their clients. So I hear analysts, I hear fund managers already. The weekend was exploding. So, other than the 40 minutes I went for a cappuccino and then some time with some friends, it's been a very, very busy weekend, and normal weekends are busy, but the weekend was exploding with all kinds of conversation. And the main message I was hearing from a lot of fund managers was, look, this trade war is really focused. It's only about the borders. It's only about drugs. And some of them are disagreeing, and I'm on the side that disagrees. That's nonsense. I don't think it's only about that, right? The second portion of this goes on to discuss taking bold action on Canada and Mexico to halt illegal immigration and fentanyl and drugs into our countries. And that's true. And Chinese officials have failed to take actions necessary. And that is true. And I agree. And the Mexican cartels operating fentanyl labs in Canada, that's mostly happening out in BC, and it's which is in the western province of Canada. For those who are unfamiliar, BC would be directly north of Washington State. So Seattle, the city, and Vancouver, the Canadian city, it's about a 2-hour drive if you don't spend too much time at the border trying to cross over. You get the idea. And for those who don't know, kind of in a unique position is that I was born in Ottawa, Canada, which is the capital of Canada. I grew up in Canada, and then I moved to the United States, of course. And so I still have a lot of contacts in Canada, and particularly in this scenario. And I've actually spoken to our Washington correspondent and a good friend of mine who actually works for the one of my closest friends, in fact, works for the CBSA, Canadian Border Services Agency, and he's probably going to be listening to this at some point. So I can provide a little bit more insight there. So the veneer here is that this is just about the drugs, and it's not about the trade war, because the United States just negotiated trade a little while ago, right? So President Trump would look poor if he was to say, look, I just negotiated this new deal with Canada and Mexico. I want to renege on that. I want a little bit more. I want to squeeze you guys for a little bit more. It's a combination. It is both. I agree. The fentanyl flow, I believe 72,000 Americans died last year of fentanyl. That's absurd. That is a very big football stadium of dead bodies because of fentanyl, right? And you can argue, well, they shouldn't have touched drugs or touched A and touched B and touched C. Well, a lot of things get contaminated that, you're not necessarily out there trying to eat fentanyl. It's when it gets contaminated into other things. Needless to say, it's killing people. This isn't a drug where, you start to hallucinate or perhaps is used recreationally as some people do. And of course, I'm not condemning or advocating that. That's not the conversation. What I'm saying is this is a drug that flatlines you, right? In small quantities. And it's very dangerous. It's used medically, but not in the quantities that we're seeing. And so obviously it's a very serious issue. And then of shoring up the borders that is part of Trump's MO. Here's why this is going to be an opportunity. And our neighboring countries in the north and to the south will capitulate. So let's bring up some data, some raw data to work with here. But just to close out, insiders, and everybody else, some good data from Friday. Friday actually was opportunistic. And so Tesla trade idea went for almost 100%. And HIMS, which we'll talk about more, which is great trade idea. We got in sub $27. That was the target. And now we're running up. I like to adjust stops. So we will be retargeting and discussing a lot of those items. There are a lot of trade ideas. I always say, adjust your stops up as you go, and there's a reason for that. And everybody else, I had a public idea on Microsoft that I published to X, and that ran for over 100%. And if you're wondering why I adjust up and say, hey, look, let's lock in profits, cutting no reentry for the rest of the day, I thought there would be some volatility regarding the tariff concerns, but it really exploded and became more than expected. And that's why you make those adjustments, because of the uncertainty, you don't risk the downside. But let's pull up some statistics. I'm going to start with Canada first. Okay. So here's the USA-Canada trade balance. And once you read this, you can probably already figure it out. You'll understand why Canada will capitulate. So Canada is bracing for an election. So the latest I believe that it will be is in October. They're long overdue for an election. They probably should have had one a long time ago. And right now, in fact, they don't really have leadership because Justin Trudeau resigned finally. Canada is moving on, but he's sort of still there. So they're in a vulnerable position anyhow. That's the point that I make. And they will likely capitulate. And the Liberal Party will likely, that is the party in power in Canada, likely gets a little bit of a bump from this very temporarily. And they get a bump just because, of course, Canadians will come together. They feel as though their country's being attacked, and Trump is portrayed as this bully internationally. And so they'll say, okay, well, let's push back, right? Canada's been hurting economically for a very long time. I grew up in Canada. I have property in Canada. My best friends are and closest friends, most of them are in Canada. A lot of my family's in Canada. We visit Canada, vacation in Canada. I know a little bit about Canada. It's in a very, very difficult place. You think home affordability is bad in the United States. Debt per capita is the worst in Canada amongst developed nations. So Canada is struggling right now. And let's look at the numbers here. So if you look at how valuable the United States is to Canada as a trading partner and how much leverage the United States. And this tells you why they'll capitulate and why this will pass. So Canada exports $717 billion in total, right? 439.6 of that is to the United States. So the United States constitutes 61% of total Canadian exports. Well, what is that of their total GDP? So it's not just their total exports. It's over 20% of the Canadian GDP, right? What is the inverse on that? Well, they take up 11.7 of American exports, 1.2% of the GDP. So if we just go to the bottom line GDP, Canada's trade constitutes 1.2%. What they buy from the United States, 1.2% of our GDP. United States constitutes 20.5%. Who has more leverage in this? There's a lot more to discuss about, well, Canada could do the following and they could build out the pipeline and they could find a refinery. All of it takes a really long time. I don't disagree. I've analyzed, I did studying in economics in Canada, so I understand the Canadian economic system. You talk about oil, yes, the tar sands, and they refine it. Canada's a net exporter of oil, but it's heavy crude oil, right? But they actually are a net importer of oil, meaning they have a lot of oil, but it's heavy unrefined oil. They don't refine it. They ship it out and it gets refined. They actually buy more petroleum products because they can't refine what they have, the heavy sands. And they don't have the pipelines to go to the east. There's a lot of logistical items that are complicated in Canada because it's such a large country, but so sparsely populated. So you'd have to build pipelines from east to west. And what people don't realize is when it comes to trade and comes to logistics, there's typically a closer American American state to Canadian provinces or major city than there is a Canadian one, right? So if you look at Vancouver on the west, which is a major city in Canada, Vancouver is closer to a major city in the United States than they are to any other major cities in Canada, meaning they're closer to Seattle than they are to Calgary, which is the next closest province over, or Edmonton, or then you have to go to Saskatchewan and, so on and so forth. And that's kind of across the board. So long story short, $86.8 billion surplus to Canada. President Trump's going to want to see that come down a little bit and have a little bit of negotiation. I believe that the drug issue and the border, that's important, but it's a veneer for negotiating. That will help him reopen negotiations. That's kind of the excuse. So I won't use the word veneer just to make it simple for everyone. He's finding an excuse to say, all right, let's squeeze them a little bit. And don't forget when he's recently posted, he talked about having meetings with Justin Trudeau and saying, why are we subsidizing your economy, right? That tells you what's really in his mind. He kept saying, why are we subsidizing your economy? I'm getting sick of subsidizing your economy. You should be the 51st state. What would happen if we stopped subsidizing you? And then not long after, we have tariffs, right? That doesn't sound like the number one conversation they had was about fentanyl or securing the border. It sounded like he was saying, look, we can squeeze you guys. And he's going to want to do that as well, because your first job is to protect your people. So the United States is a massive component of the total Canadian GDP and total Canadian exports. The longer this goes, it brings the Canadian economy to its knees. And the Liberal Party right now, because they're prepping for an election, has to put on a strong front. You can't just capitulate because their base likes to cheer. It's the left versus right nonsense as usual. This is a left government, so this is the Liberal Party of Canada. Their base looks at Donald Trump as a bully, and so they're going to want to give them something to shake their fists at and say, we're fighting them and we're coming back at them. If they capitulate in a couple days, their base will be very disappointed, and they're already hobbled. They're likely to not only lose, they won't form a minority. So that's the simple part. So it could extend a little bit, but I think President Trump gets more aggressive, and ultimately, if it really goes off, Canada gets crushed. What about Mexico? Well, similar. We're 71% of total Mexican exports. They're 9.7 of the United States. They constitute 1% of total GDP for the United States. The United States constitutes 24.7, nearly a fourth of total Mexican GDP is exports to the United States. That is a crippling number, and the surplus is even bigger. Now, you can have a lot of arguments about the economics of it and say, well, this is why there are key things that we import from them. It's a win-win for everybody. I'm not discussing politics, right? I'm not even going into the depth of economics. I'm looking at the numbers to see who has leverage. I'm discussing this from a leverage standpoint. The United States has a tremendous amount of leverage. If we lost 1% of our GDP overnight, that would be painful. It'd be very painful. If Mexico lost 24.7, that would be like a meteor hitting a huge portion of the country and wiping it out. If Canada lost 20.5% of its GDP, it goes from a first world country to a second world country overnight. You get the idea. So that's why I think this is panic. It might take a little bit of time because both nations need to dig their heels in. You don't want to look weak to your country and say, geez, President Trump, who we portray as a bully, and even if you don't believe that he is, or if you do, you have to portray that to your people because you want to say, hey, I don't get pushed around by bullies. We're fighting back. And this is what we're doing about it. And we're hitting you guys with tariffs. No more maple syrup for anybody, right? You get the idea. And to Canadians, relax. I'm Canadian as well. I mix where I buy my maple syrup from. Actually, I don't really buy it very often because I don't eat a lot of sugar, but you get the idea. So you have to put on a brave face. You have to do that to maintain an appearance of strength in front of your people. And this could blow over a lot sooner. If it extends, what I believe happens is President Trump becomes infinitely more aggressive, right? This is the beginning of his term. So he has every reason to be hyper aggressive because he has to set an example going forward. Otherwise, this will define his term on how he deals with other countries and how he implements tariffs, which has been at the center of his platform. For Canada, for Mexico, it's a decent position. She's into her term. For Canada, this is the opposite. They're at the end of a term and facing an election. So the pressure will mount sooner. They're going to be watching the polls. The early portion where Canadians give them a bump because they shake their fists and say, we won't be pushed around by Americans, because that's a lot of the attitude in Canada. It's you always see Americans as adversarial. I know Americans don't think of that way of Canadians, but Canadians see this sort of, okay, what do we do with the Americans? And it's not because they feel poorly towards Americans, it's because there's a very big economic component. So we see this as opportunity. This will be an even bigger opportunity because we dip down. And ultimately, what we have seen from a variety of companies is 79% of the companies that have reported thus far have reported on balance positively with the S&P 500. And so we do have earnings reports coming up this week. And that continues to be positive. I think the shock and awe here will, in time, turn this into a strong opportunity, but just know it could extend a little bit because countries need to dig their heels in now. I believe there will be meetings tomorrow because President Trump has said as much, and that's being underreported. They could start finding a resolution. He does not seeking a trade war, right? He has to stand strong, but he's not seeking a trade war. So I think at the earliest, we start to see some resolution this week. But if it takes longer, the drawdown is an opportunity. Fundamentally, nothing has changed with the market. And the impact that I've shown you to the American GDP is nothing compared to its counterparts. And this is something we could sustain. And even if there's that threat, maybe the Feds start feeling as though they have to cut rates sooner because they're fearful of this. And then if President Trump is able to get what he wants on the trade deals and the Feds panic cut a little bit, then he wins across the board because he's been trying to pressure the Feds into cutting. So that's it for the public version of this. Private version, insiders, stay tuned. We got a little bit more to go with.